Lewis and Clark State Historic Site is celebrating 20 years.
As promised, I said I would share a few stories about those early times here at Lewis and Clark State Historic Site and some of the early influences that I had upon me about the fate of where the historic site was going to be heading. Remember, I started at the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency in 1998, but in the spring of 2001, I would get given an opportunity, very much like an opportunity given to this guy right here behind me, Meriwether Lewis. When he was given this opportunity in 1803 to lead an expedition, it was a pretty large undertaking. He was a young, 29-year-old officer in the United States Army, tasked with then leading an expedition that would in many ways lead to the success or fate of this new emerging country. I had just started with the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency. I'd only been around for about 3 years working at Lincoln's New Salem. And suddenly I was going to be elevated to a historic site superintendent in charge of an $8 million construction project. Can you see the parallels a little bit? But probably very much like Lewis, I had no idea what to expect about what was going to suddenly be thrust in front of me. Lewis had to prepare for an expedition that would very much look at the fate of where the nation was going to be heading. We had just negotiated the purchase of $15 million worth of land that would roughly double the size of the United States. The state of Illinois and the National Park Service and the United States government had just put down $8 million towards the construction of a new interpretive center, both of which were under a timeline. So when I came on board, I very much felt the pressure, somewhat akin to the pressure that I think probably Lewis felt about what he needed to do and how to accomplish that with a measure of success. You know, later on in my time here at Lewis and Clark, I began looking into leadership examples of what Lewis and Clark represent and what it is to be a good leader. And I think I took my early inspiration from Meriwether Lewis at that time. I was being asked to determine whether or not an $8 million investment on this new Lewis and Clark State Historic Site was the right decision, and whether or not we as an agency, we as the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, could lead the design on the exhibits and the story and pit that all in a time frame very, very much like Meriwether Lewis. Lewis had just a few months to get ready before he was set to depart, as it turned out to be May 14th of 1804. I had roughly about a year to a year and a half to make sure that the visitor center was finished, the exhibits were done, and we were ready for a one-year shakedown, if you will, about the Lewis and Clark story before the national bicentennial hit. Just like Lewis, we had to pick the right people, and as it turns out, I think we did a pretty good job finding the right staff that would join this expedition here at Lewis and Clark Historic Site. People like Cindy Upchurch, Dennis Nichols, Pam Imes, Mike Stout, Bill Higgins, all part of that early staff members. But just like Lewis, we also had to trust the people that were here in the community, who were part of this story already, and that being the Lewis and Clark Society of America. We reached out to colleagues and allies like the National Park Service. We reached out to people here in the community like the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Commission for both Illinois and the National Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Commission. So much that these guys can tell us, and I learned that lesson pretty early on, that history can be cyclical, but in the grand scheme of things, history is just a story about us. A guy like Lewis, who was 29 years old, who was suddenly thrust into a major deal of responsibility, and a 30-year-old guy like me who was suddenly given an opportunity to oversee a construction project unlike anything he'd ever seen before. There was a lot of inspiration that I could get from these guys. And I hope I've lived up to their story. And so I invite you again to come with me this year as we continue to share some of those stories about those early connections to our own Lewis and Clark journey.